key events in regard to the Holocaust in the Soviet Union. After that state's dissolution, understandable,
Guys, come on in. He's already
we
started.
must first pay attention to a major issue of geography. The parts of the former Soviet Union in which the Germans killed Jews systematically are now, for the most part, not in what is currently called the Russian Federation. The three Baltic states were both the first ones to break away from the Soviet Union and an early and important site of the Holocaust. The part of eastern Poland was seized by the Soviets in 1939 in accordance with the agreement with Nazi Germany that I discussed on Monday, were incorporated in what were then the Belarusian and Ukrainian Soviet Socialist republics. Practically the whole of these two units of the Soviet Union were at some point in 1941 or 42 occupied by the Germans, and the location for the bulk of the killing of Jews in the Soviet Union. The parts of Romania seized by the Soviet Union in 1940 and then retaken by the Germans and Romanians together with the additional Ukrainian territory occupied by the Romanians in 1941 and 42, and also the sites of mass killing of Jews, are now part of the new Ukrainian state, or in the entirely new country of Moldova. I don't want to suggest that there was no killing of Jews in the territory that is now in the Russian Federation. There was some in the central portion of the Eastern Front, the northern part of the front between the Baltic states and the front just south of Leningrad, and when the Germans temporarily occupied territory beyond the borders of Ukraine at the southern end of the front in 1941 and 42. And of course, the northern half, let's see, we're talking this piece here. The northern half of what was once German East Prussia is now part of the Russian Federation, and it had its Jewish inhabitants sent to killing centers in 1941 and 1942. The point to be noted, however, is that something in the vicinity of 90% of the Jews killed by the Germans in the Soviet Union were killed in areas that are now in the Baltic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Moldova. This makes my topic rather complicated, and I'm sorry if at first that sounds a bit confusing, but I can only offer the same answer that I give when folks complain about the size of my history of World War II. It was a very big war, and that's not my fault. The new territorial arrangements in Eastern Europe at first looked a bit complicated, but they were made by those involved without consulting me. What I will do is to take up the different countries first, one at a time, and then make some general observations. I will start with Lithuania, you see on the map, where in fact some of the most horrendous events of the very beginning of the Holocaust occurred. There was probably more systematic, very active, direct participation by non-Jewish locals in the Holocaust in Lithuania than anywhere else. I am referring to actual killing of Jews, not the assistance by rounding them up before killing, or looting their homes afterwards, or other such things. The recent book about the police battalion from Bremen that I referred to on Monday has a detailed account of the extent of local participation, and there is other considerable literature on this subject. There is an extensive literature on the Holocaust in Lithuania, with special emphasis on the Jews of Kovno and Vilna. The participation of locals in the German murder program, the Jewish resistance, and the Japanese diplomat Sugihara, who helped many Jews escape. There is also some material on Lithuanians who hid or in other ways assisted Jews. Now that Lithuania is again independent, there are serious problems for that society to face. It has to come to grips with the extensive participation of Lithuanians in the German killing program and with the role of Jews in the Soviet partisan movement that resisted German occupation. For obvious reasons, some Jews who managed to flee from the ghettos into the woods joined whatever resistance movements were already there or organized their own. Since in view of the geographic reality, a German defeat was certain to bring back the Soviet rule that Lithuanians didn't want either, there were those who continued to think of the partisans as simply the advance guard of the Red Army they hadn't wanted in 1939 or in 1940. This is a subject, I suggest, that will continue to agitate public affairs in Lithuania for years to come. The Japanese can now make kind remarks about Sugihara that the Tokyo government certainly did not make at the time. But the issues for the people of Lithuania are and will remain very much more complicated. The situation in Latvia is slightly different. There is certainly much literature on the killing of Jews from the capital city, Riga, and other towns. But in some ways, the situation is not quite like that of Lithuania. There was, especially in the first months of German occupation, a considerable amount of collaboration with the Germans, who were initially seen by many as liberators from Soviet control. But there was not the extremely wide participation in the killing of Jews by locals, as was the case in Lithuania. That difference has, at least in my opinion, made it a tiny bit easier for the once again independent people of Latvia to look back at the events of 1941 to 1944. There remain some real difficulties, but not quite as many. Estonia is a country that has a history in regard to the Holocaust that is rather different from that of just about any other part of Europe. There were neither substantial numbers of Jews in the country, nor a long record of extreme anti-Semitism. There was, again, especially in the first months of German occupation, considerable collaboration, but not, as far as we can tell, in the killing of Jews. That was done essentially entirely by German SS police and army units. Ironically, in the last year of the German occupation, several hundred Jews from Lithuania were deported to slave labor in Estonia for reasons I've never been able to figure out and that the existing literature does not, as far as I know, explain. Those Jews were, for the most part, either worked to death or killed by the Germans, and hence do not figure in post-independence Estonian public debate. When I participated in a conference on certain aspects of World War II fighting in Estonia a few years ago, my impression was that the subject of the Holocaust was neither particularly prominent nor especially contentious there. We now turn to Belarus. Go back. The most important book on Belarus during the German occupation is unfortunately only available in German. There is a fine museum on Belarus in World War II in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, but it does not mention the Holocaust, or at least did not do so when I was there in 2005. The same thing is true for the very impressive memorial to the destroyed communities of Belarus in Khartoum, or at least that wasn't when I was there. Since the Germans killed a higher percentage of the population in Belarus than anywhere else, almost a quarter of the whole population, it is impressive that the reconciliation with the Federal Republic of Germany has moved as far as it clearly has. It was also interesting for me, as one who had published a piece on the role of air power in partisan warfare in World War II, Soviet Union, to see in the outdoor part of the Minsk World War II Museum an original American DC-3, the Dakota, as it was called, on display with a helpful explanation. That airplane, provided by the United States to the Soviets in large numbers, was extremely important for the Soviets in supplying, directing, and in other ways keeping the partisan movement in Belarus effective. While those two signs look good to me, the country is evidently only in the original initial stages of engaging the killing of most of its Jewish inhabitants during the war. One reason for this is probably the sanctioned or at least tolerated strong anti-Semitism in Belarus since independence. As a result of this, about 90% of the surviving Jewish population in Belarus, once somewhere around 150,000, have left for Israel, the United States, and some other countries. May I suggest an additional explanation for this gap in the country's past that may not appeal to all. The current and now longtime dictator of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, is simply not interested in the topic. This is different from the next part of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine, where some have had a definite interest in deliberately ignoring the subject and or pretending that it doesn't exist. The newly independent Ukraine has had to engage the fact that large numbers of Ukrainians had enlisted in German military auxiliary police forces and slaughtered Jews, Poles, and quite often other Ukrainians who held different political views, rather than religious or nationality characteristics. This is an issue that will agitate Ukrainian society for decades to come. There is, on the one hand, the desire frequently implemented in practice to make the people and the events of the past disappear altogether. An excellent illustration of this in the western portion of the Ukraine is described in Omar Bartov's book, appropriately entitled Erased. On the other hand, a French Catholic priest referred to earlier, whose activities are recounted by Patrick Du Bois, has been very active in turning up mass graves of murdered Jews in the Ukraine and collecting evidence about the related events at the time and since. There are those in the country who believe that the effort needs to be made to face the past, and over time it is at least possible that the very existence and continuation of controversy will lead to some realistic assessments of what happened. And I noticed in the most recent bulletin of our U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum that there is a student who has won a J.B. and Morris C. Shapiro Senior Scholar in Residence Fellowship there from the Ukrainian Institute for Holocaust Studies. There is serious work being done there by people who, in fact, are serious about their scholarship. What is almost certain to continue to make for difficulties in any honest look into the events of 1941 to 44 in the Ukraine is that so many of the leaders and followers at the time moved back and forth in their opinions and allegiances and in the policies they advocated and adopted. This is perhaps best, or worst if you prefer, illustrated by the head of the Ukrainian Union Church at the time, Andrei Shapinsky. On the one hand, he encouraged cooperation with the Germans and urged Ukrainians to enlist in the Galician army of the Armed Division of the Armed SS, one of whose functions was to hunt and kill Jews. On the other hand, he sent protests to the Vatican against the extermination of Jews, published a special message, quote, "Thou shalt not murder," in November 1941, and is known to have made efforts to save individual Jews. You may have seen in the papers recently about the discovery in Minneapolis of an officer of one of the Ukrainian military units fighting alongside the Germans. The Office of Special Investigations in the United States Department of Justice will presumably try to have him denaturalized, deported, as they have succeeded in numerous prior cases. But you may also have noticed that it is the Polish and German investigators who are thinking of trying him if they can get their hands on him. There is, to the best of my knowledge in the reports so far, no indication that anyone in the Ukraine is interested. From the Ukraine, we continue to Moldova. The territory of this new political unit on the map of Europe includes a whole series of places where masses of Jews were murdered. This is one part of the former Soviet Union where the Holocaust certainly included the deaths of several 100,000 Jews. But I'm afraid that I have not seen any recent literature or news stories that provide useful clues as to how these events have been seen in the recent past and are seen today. In 1942, German forces expected to enter what are now the independent countries of Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and expected to kill Jews there. But the Red Army held them before any substantial portion of these countries could be occupied. That therefore brings us to the Russian Federation. There has been in recent years a certain amount of serious looking into the whole subject of the Holocaust in what I will now simply call Russia. The subject is no longer systematically repressed or distorted as was true in the Soviet period, a subject on which you've heard more than you want to hear, I suspect. It is now considered appropriate to hold conferences on the subject of the Holocaust, to publish books and articles about it, and to consider ways in which to include references to it in the history of the country as it is taught in the schools. I do not want to suggest that there are no problems in Russia's heritage in this regard, but I would suggest that there is a greater willingness to recognize the centrality of the issue for the Germans in World War II and to look at the topic as an important one that deserves serious study than in any of the newly independent states that have broken away from the former Soviet Union. Having taken up the state units one by one, I now want to cover some topics that are essentially common to all, or almost all of them. As a professional historian, I will naturally take up first the issue of archives and access to them. It would, it seems to me, be fair to say that the whole access issue has changed substantially since the breakup of the Soviet Union. While it is true that ironically in Russia itself, the early substantial openings have not continued, but in some instances have been reversed. In the newly independent states, there has been generally a much greater willingness to allow scholars access to the wartime records. Since the paper of that time is particularly bad and continually physically deteriorating, the next decade or two will be the last time that anyone can read them unless they've been or soon on microfilm. The more restrictive policy of Russia in this regard in recent years is likely to keep anyone from ever being able to see them, and that includes those who are keeping them secret and closed. A somewhat different aspect of the archives issue concerns German documents that were captured by the Red Army or simply abandoned by the Germans as they evacuated. It has turned out that in addition to those in the special archive, the Osobye Archiv, near Moscow, which is being accessed in part by German representatives who are allowed to microfilm there, lots of German records ended up in all sorts of other places. There are some in Russian Oblast archives, and there are some in the archives of the newly independent states. What has been and will for some time be of great importance for our understanding of aspects of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union is that in general, these records have been and are being made accessible to scholars both from the area and from other countries. much of the recent literature on the Holocaust in the Soviet Union is enriched by such aspects. And I would expect this process to continue. The book by Wendy Lauer that was on the reading list, which I believe was circulated to you, may serve as an example of this type of important scholarly work enriched by newly accessible German contemporary records. An opposite situation exists in regard to an important topic that, although it's been mentioned here a couple of times, remains almost completely unexplored. That is the issue of the treatment of Jewish prisoners of war by the Germans. On the one hand, there was the general policy of terrible treatment, shooting political officers and letting prisoners of war die of hunger and disease. By their own figures, in the first 7 months of the fighting, the Germans killed or let die an average of 10,000 Red Army prisoners of war every day, 7 days a week for 7 months, for a total of over 2 million. More than 1 million additional prisoners died or were killed by the Germans thereafter. Since the German army in July 1941 issued separate special orders for the killing of all Jewish prisoners of war, the question that needs examining is the degree to which this actually happened. The subject awaits substantial investigation. We know that this was done in many cases, but there is also evidence that in other cases, Jewish prisoners of war, known to be so, were not killed. You have already heard and seen with examples information about the whole issue of monuments. So I won't go into that. An issue that I am convinced will arise more often in the future concerns Jewish cemeteries. Another issue that the successor states of the Soviet Union inherited is that of possible trials of Holocaust perpetrators. This is a subject that, as far as I know, awaits systematic investigation. The other side of this question is the willingness in some quarters, especially in the Baltic states and Ukraine, to acclaim as heroes individuals who among other things, participated in the slaughter of Jews. This should be seen as part of the matters that I earlier referred to in connection with individual new states, especially Lithuania and Ukraine. Closely related to the subject that I just touched on is the fate of individuals from the former Soviet Union who entered the United States illegally and have been denaturalized and deported through the efforts of the Office of Special Investigations of the Justice Department. Almost by definition, these individuals will, for the most part, have died by now. But a comparative and systematic review of their fates on return would be rather interesting. It would also provide some helpful insights into the developing attitudes toward the Holocaust in the communities and countries to which they have been deported. There are, I would suggest, from personal experience, some other aspects to this. Some of you may well recall when President Clinton nominated General Shalikashvili to be chairman of the American Joint Chiefs of Staff. His father had served in the Georgian Legion, which was subsumed into the armed SS in the last part of World War II. Brought his children, including the man who came to be the general that I mentioned, to this country. When Charlie, as everybody called him for short Charlie, when Charlie was nominated, I had a series of telephone calls from newspaper people who perhaps thought they could make a big to-do when his name came up before the U.S. Senate. And I had heard nothing but nice things about him, and repeated them, which needless to say were not quoted. And it turned out by a coincidence that the historian on his staff when he was in command in Europe, before he was nominated to be chair, was a former student of ours in Chapel Hill who had nothing but good things to say about it. Needless to say, none of the nice things I said were quoted. Then, as some of you will recall, the president nominated Madeleine Albright for Secretary of State. It then turned out that there was a Jewish background and that members of her family had been killed in the Holocaust. Again, I received some phone calls. How could a Secretary of State work with a chairman of the Joint Chiefs when members of the family of one have been killed by an organization of which the father of the other had, at the end of the war, been a member? I suggested that, number one, people should not be punished for what their parents might or might not have done, that these were both very sensible people, and that the only problem I could think of was that if one of them is a chain smoker and the other is allergic, but I thought it most likely that they would work that out. You will understand this was not quoted in the papers either, and soon, some years after, at the first international conference at our National World War II Museum in New Orleans, the then former Secretary of State Albright was the dinner speaker, and I had been the opening speaker, so I had a chance to tell her this story. She just about fell off her chair laughing, and told me that when she was the American representative to the United Nations before her appointment, she had been involved in a UN activity which had brought her in contact with Shalikashvili when he was in command in Europe. They had become good friends, and now that they were both retired, they stayed and saw each other from time to time. She would tell him this story the next time she saw him, and was reasonably certain that he would find it as funny as she did. There are, in other words, aspects of this issue which are, if you will allow me to say so, rather complicated. An additional issue that has begun, oh, I should say one other thing. I was very careful not to say to any of the reporters that Shalikashvili's father almost certainly entered the United States illegally. If they couldn't figure this out, I didn't think it was my business. Now that we had this outstanding general to call it to their attention. An additional issue that has begun to arise in some of the new states and could come up in the future is that of Jewish community and individually owned property. That issue has been very much on the agenda in Central and Western Europe and in this country in the last half century. It has also, especially when stolen artworks are involved, made its way to the courts of the United States, including a case that twice went to the Supreme Court. My point is that this type of issue was left behind by the Holocaust to the former Soviet Union states and is often very difficult to resolve, since in most countries, the statute of limitations on suits begins to arise only when a claim is filed. The belief that property claims are void because of statute of limitations in whichever country they are filed is most likely erroneous. I claim no expertise in such legal matters, but my point is that a variety of community and individual property issues may well continue to arise for years in the successor states of the Soviet Union. The way in which such cases are handled in different states may provide some additional clues as to how the government and peoples of those states view the terrible events that occurred within them during the war. In this type of issue, there may well be substantial differences between the handling of what look like similar cases in some countries. Please don't be upset if I illustrate this by two cases in this country in which the same type of issue was handled in totally different ways. In the famous or notorious Altman case, the Austrians spent years and vast sums of money in legal fees to keep the heirs from recovering the paintings, for the most part by Klimt, that had been taken from family members during the years of Nazi rule. The United States Supreme Court ruled against them, and the pictures are now in a museum right here in New York, while the Austrians have a large collection of lawyers' receipts. Over a decade ago, the North Carolina Museum of Art was informed that a Carnot painting on exhibit had been donated to the museum, but had previously been confiscated by the Nazis. They promptly turned it over to the two elderly ladies in Vienna who were the legal heirs. The museum asked them for, and was quoted, a concessionary price and some months to try to raise the money to buy the painting. The museum raised the money, and now, next to the picture in the museum, there is, in addition to the standard museum label, a separate text providing a brief history of the painting. In that text, the two ladies are listed as having contributed to the museum's ability to purchase the painting. The reason that I recount this difference in the handling of similar property claims is that it's entirely possible that there might be a wide variety in the way such issues are handled in the future in the former Soviet Union. And one must be careful to note that only clearly discernible patterns can be taken as clues to the wider policy preferences of the societies in which these issues arise. Leaving aside for a moment the issue of art, I would suggest that real estate is more likely to be an issue of concern and suits in the future. Closely related to it is the issue of the fate of Jewish cemeteries that I alluded to earlier. the frequently expressed view in recent years that we've heard enough about the Holocaust is likely to prove unconvincing, as the topics I have just mentioned are likely to arise again and be revived from time to time. The past is very rarely completely past. The Queen of England nowadays gives her assent to laws passed by the British Parliament, not in English, but in French, although the original language of her family is German, and the Norman conquest of England will be commemorated for its 1000th anniversary in a mere 53 years. Historians generally predict the past, not the future. But I am inclined to think that the lands that once constituted the Soviet Union will be obliged to engage Holocaust issues for many decades to come.
We have a few minutes before, so I want to take some questions. And before you leave, you must, okay, this is an obligation to fill out your evaluation forms and be honest. And of course, that was great. But in addition to that, really, we want to know what you think. So let's take a few questions. Okay, Mrs. Kelly.
Thank you. I have a question. I wasn't a teen, as you mentioned before, and my father and my mom, they were in the partisan units there. My father was at a time in that unit that caused, they were hiding, that caused the burning of that little village of Patin. They have now the chimney, which every half hour sounds the bells, and they are mentioned, they're all around the perimeter of, I believe it's a monument, all the shepherds around, there was the amount of Jews that lived and perished. Would you consider that an accurate or representative of the community? I think
It's a little, maybe we'll ask that later, because it's a little bit complicated. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Let's, other questions.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Oh, yes, okay. Mrs. Berger.
My father, his parents, and his sister were all killed by Einsatzgruppen September 11, 1941. My grandfather had a huge, huge farm, which I saw last summer. I went to Lithuania. When my mother wrote a letter, or she hired a lawyer, my mother, Elisha, is deceased now. She was told we could not get that property only if we give up our American citizenship and move to Lithuania. Is there any place in which I can inquire?
Okay, did everybody hear the question? Okay, the question is that Mrs. Berger's father had a farm in Lithuania, and grandfather and their family was told that they could only acquire that, get that property back if they renounce American citizenship and move to Lithuania.
the same thing as a woman, you have to live
Okay,
I would suggest that the legal issues which are involved here involve a really serious or possibly mistaken reading of the law in Lithuania and in this country. You will all be relieved to know that I do not have a law degree. But there are people who are experts at this and can look into the two interrelated but still separate issues. One is the extent to which one can, and at times people do, sue in American courts against a foreign government and in some occasions, that's all I can say, actually win something, and then properties from that foreign government and assets in this country can be used and are used to pay whatever the courts rule. The other side of this is, of course, what in fact is the legal situation in Lithuania. And, excuse me, I certainly am even more ignorant there. But it is, again, an issue that deserves, I would suggest, exploration. This may have simply been an easy way to fob somebody off. The notion that one has to be a Lithuanian citizen to win a case in a Lithuanian court seems to me not very likely and deserving of further exploration. This is why I mentioned the whole property issue, especially the real property issue, as one likely to continue to arise in all of the successive states of the Soviet Union.
Thank you. All right, if there's no other questions, I'd like to give Professor Weinberg and Professor Gerhard all right. I want to thank you all.